Hello, guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures. And today, after the last part, and then now we're moving on to the kind of eve of the Twilight Pack, which I'm actually really excited to have a look at. We've got the part of 103, which has some pretty cool animals in it, actually. So I'm quite excited to get stuck into this one. A couple new returns of new species, and then a couple new animals that we'll get into, including one really cool one at the end that you saw in the thumbnail. So we're going to be starting off today. We've got the white-headed lemur by Leaf, who did a really wonderful job with this one. We're going to have a look down here. So this is the white-headed lemur, also known as the white-headed brown lemur, or the white-fronted brown lemur, or the white-fronted lemur. Their kind of scientific name is Eulema albifrons. And these guys are a species in the family Lemuridae, so they're a type of lemur, of course. These guys are actually only found in northeastern Madagascar and are arboreal and can be usually found on the treetops. And before it kind of became its own species, it was recognized as a subspecies of the common brown lemur, but now it's obviously split. So these guys are a kind of medium-sized lemur with a horizontal posture, which is suited for its way of movement. They typically get to a weight of about 2.3 kilograms. And about 40 centimeters long with the body length, so about 5 pounds, 16 inches, and they have a tail that adds another 50, or about 20 inches, so they have about a 19 centimeter long body and tail, so that pretty much makes them a meter long, a little bit less than a meter. And you can see they've got this long, fuzzy tail that allows them to maintain balance in the trees, very similar to other closely related lemurs. And they have grey-brown underparts in the males, and they have darker lower limbs and paler faces, you can see here in a darker crown, but females typically have redder brown underparts with paler underground and darker feet than males. So you can see this is a male here. Female is a little bit more reddish, as you can kind of see here. It really gives them a little bit of a distinct look to them. And the head, face, and muzzle of these guys, as you can see, are kind of this dark grey, but the females don't really have that blushy cheeks as that the males have, so it gives them a little bit more distinct. Really cool. And in terms of their habitat, these guys typically live in lowland or montane forests. And you can see the white-headed lemur here is, like a lot of other species of lemurs, quite arboreal. So they spend most of the time up in the trees in the upper layers of forests, and they can only really be found in the northeastern parts of Madagascar. So in terms of their breeding and mature mating, these guys are carnothermal, or that's if easy to say that. So this means that they basically come out at any times of the day, varying times, day and night, doesn't really matter to them. And they have an omnivorous diet, so that means they feed on fruits, mature leaves, sap, bark, soil, even insects and small centipedes, millipedes, basically small invertebrates, those kind of things. And their diet typically changes depending on the reproductive stage of their life. Let's see if we can find one more around here. On the reproductive stage. So during gestation, both males and females will typically supplement their diets with flowers, and during lactation, more flowers and young leaves are kind of eaten. But when they're not reproducing, they eat more mature leaves and other things like millipedes, which is pretty interesting. So the mating system of the lemur is not really reported of this type of lemur, but other relatives show that they're potentially either monogamous or polygamous, and it's likely that the white-headed lemur is quite similar to this. And as we talk about that, we'll have a look at these cute little babies here. I want to have a look at the babies. Let me look at the babies. Look at these cute little guys. Anyway, they're likely that these guys, for their first 3 weeks of life, they tend to hang off their mother and hang off her belly, and then they'll alter their grasps really only to nurse. And after this 3 weeks has passed, they typically shift and ride on their mother's back, and then it'll start to take its first steps. After that, is obviously growing up. And following this, it starts to sample solid food and nibbling on whatever the other members of the group happen to be eating and kind of learning what's food, what's not food. And this has actually started to be their first sign of independence. And then nursing continues until the infant diet tapers. So basically, it starts moving on to solid foods rather than milk. And the young lemur is actually weaned from milk at about the age of 4 months, and usually this happens around January. And like other members of the genus, females are not usually as dominant as males, so the degree of which females exert active mate choice is not really known, but they're known to form multi-male, multi-female groups, and depending on the population, these groups can vary a lot. and is usually numbers between 3 to 12 individuals, with about 5 to 7 on average. And what kind of sucks is that these guys are considered vulnerable. So they are still commonish. They have a large range, but similar to a lot of other species on Madagascar, they are subject to a lot of habitat degradation and things like that. So it's not very good for them, but still really cool animal to have in Planet Zoo. Leaf did a really wonderful job. Next, moving on to an animal from my homeland. I'm very excited to talk about this guy. We've got the South Island takahe from Genora Pizza and Ginger Toast, who really did a wonderful job with us. Really, really cool animals here. So these are the South Island takahe, or Phosphorohosteteroi. These guys are a flightless species of swamp hen that are indigenous to New Zealand. They're technically only found in the South Island, but they have been introduced into different sanctuaries and islands on the North Island for their conservation. And they're the largest living member of the rail family, as I'll get into. They're often known as just takahe, but the reason they often are called the South Island takahe is because there's the recently extinct North Island takahe that is kind of similar to them. They're not that closely related, as I'll get into. During basically when they were found, there was found fossils of them by Walter Mantell around like South Taranaki, and those were the northern species of takahe where they first found. But then they managed to find 2 years later after that discovery, they found the South Island takahe living around the Fiordland with sealers finding them and commenting on them as well, which is really, really interesting. And then they were collected and all that, and then they were thought to be extinct for like nearly 100 years, which we'll get into, which is really, really interesting. In terms of the two species of takahe, there was Notornis, that was the old genus with both the Mantelli, Notornis mantelli and Holsteteroi. So they're originally two different species. Well, they still are two different species in that genus Notornis. But what happens is that genetics show that they're actually not that closely related. So they're both lumped into the genus Popero, which has got the other species of swamp hens, like the African swamp hen, the Australasian swamp hen, the purple swamp hen, those kind of animals. But turns out these guys are not that closely related. There's two separate radiations that came from outside of New Zealand and settled. So the first radiation was the South Island takahe, which came from the African swamp hen, or more basal species of swamp hen, that was around the Pliocene, so about 5 or so million years ago. And then a couple million years ago, the North Island takahe came to New Zealand, and that's more closely related to the Australian swamp hen. So that's really, really interesting. So they were pretty much living fine in New Zealand until humans came. First, the Māori came, and they brought the dogs and the and fire and the Polynesian rat, or the kuri, and that obviously caused. Oh no, that's the dog. The Polynesian dog's the kuri, and then the Polynesian rats, things like that. They basically annihilated a lot of these species and really caused a decline, even to the point where the North Island takahe was pretty much extinct by the time Europeans came. There's only been like one specimen really found of a live North Island takahe. And then these guys were thought to be extinct until they were discovered by the physician Geoffrey Orbell near Lake Tiamuru, or Lake Tiao I mean, in the Murchison Mountains, at about the 20th of November in 1948. So that's when they basically found footprints, and then they captured two birds, and was like, they come back from extinction. Everyone was like, what the heck? And turns out there was only a small population left, because by that time, about that time, there would have been a lot of animals introduced by European settlers, so like stoats, weasels, cats, and that they often prey upon either young or adult takahe. So basically, they were only restricted to the high mountains where they could survive. But yeah, they seem to be doing okay now in terms of there's about 450 of them left, as I'll get into, which is pretty interesting. In terms of their description, these guys are, as I mentioned, the largest rail alive, the largest living species. They get about 63 centimeters, or about 25 inches in length, and they weigh on average between about 2.7 kilograms, or 6 pounds in males, and about 2.3 kilograms, or 5 pounds in females. But they range between 1.8 to 4.2 kilograms, so about 4 to 9 pounds. And they have a lifespan of about 18 in the wild and 22 years in animal sanctuaries. or the fence sanctuaries. They typically have a standing height of about 50 centimeters tall. As you can see, they're quite a stocky bird, and they're also flightless. So they have these strong legs and massive bills, which they can use to uh, obviously hunt in grasses and things like that. They break apart grasses, things like that. And you can see they've got really beautiful colors as well. They've got the red beak and the red feet. And they've also got this kind of like iridescent, almost navy blue on them, and a little bit of a green and yellow on them. Oh, not yellow, green and kind of blue on them. This was really, really nice. Olive green as well. And in terms of the sexes, these guys are similar, though the females are slightly smaller. The young babies, as you can see here, they're kind of considered jet black. As you can see here, it looks really, really interesting of them. They look really, really cute. And immature individuals will have a duller version of the adult coloring, and then that basically comes in once they mature. They're also quite noisy. They have a non-directional whooping call, which was described by the rediscoverers of the Takahe almost like whistling to them over through a cartridge, which is pretty interesting, and some other different calls. And their call can actually be confused a lot with the weka, though these guys are generally more deeper and resonant than the weka. In terms of their biology and like ecology, these guys are sedentary and flightless, so they tend to be currently found in grassland habitats, though upland grassland habitats, though they used to be found in much more varied habitats before humans came, before they really declined. And they're typically kind of almost like the mountain goat or like the small goat of New Zealand's ecology. They feed on all sorts of plants and things like that, particularly grasses, but they will also feed on insects and things like that. There's even been reports of a paradise duckling in a fence sanctuary called Zealandia that was killed by a Takahe, which is pretty interesting. And in terms of breeding, these guys are monogamous, so they breed in pairs, and the pairs will remain together for about 12 years or so, or potentially even their entire lives. They typically build a bulky nest under like bushes and shrubs, and they lay 1 to 3 buff eggs in them. And the survival rate for chicks can range between 25 and 80%, depending whether they're on a fence sanctuary or if they're out in the open, because obviously they get attacked by stoats and things. Really, really cool little guys here. In terms of their conservation, as I mentioned, they're pretty much found everywhere in the South Island until humans came, both the Maori and the Europeans. And now they basically live in 2 sites. They live near Lake Te Anau as well, and they're found in the Murchison Mountains, and they've been introduced to other sanctuaries as well. The Kata Rangi National Park, where they also live, they've been reintroduced there around 2018. But they can also be found in all sorts of different thing sanctuaries along New Zealand, including Tiritiri Matangi, Maud Island, Mount Bruce, Mangatautri, Willowbank, the Orinoco Eco Sanctuary, which is all through the North and South Islands. So you can see there's almost a little bit of rewilding going on with them being put in kind of in place of the North Island Take. But in terms of their conservation, because of the overhunting, the loss of habitat, the introduced predators, and also the introduction of deer and stuff, which compete for them, they basically caused their population to really decline. And it was estimated that by the time they were rediscovered, there was only a couple hundred Takahe left. And before they actually started to do really serious conservation work and help out these guys, there was really only probably 100 or so left. But after some really good conservation work, they basically pioneered this kind of technique of taking animals onto offshore islands and sanctuaries and kind of breeding them up and then releasing. That was something that had never been done before at the time. And now it's kind of a really staple method of conservation in New Zealand. So they really pioneered that, and it's really helped the Takahe well. They obviously caused great public interest after they were rediscovered, and they took them in and created these islands, sanctuaries, and also bred them in captivity. But yeah, they basically created like the Burwood Takahe Breeding Centre in Tianu. I mean, I keep saying that wrong. I keep thinking of another place that's closer to me, where they've been reared up and then released into the wild and also put into sanctuaries and things like that. And there's also been further efforts to protect them. There's like pest control going on, and all these efforts have actually been taking pretty well, since their population has basically increased. The population as of like 2020 is about 450 Takahe, and the original long-term goal is to have well over 500 adult Takahe. So doing quite well, we're on track, and it's a great example of great conservation work going on. So it's really, really awesome to see these guys doing well. And yeah, I love talking about animals from my native homeland and all that. Really, really awesome animals that do love Takahe. done by Genora Pizza and Ginger Toast. All did a wonderful job. Next, we're moving on to some animals that have been coming back from the olden days and back as new species. We've got here the Somali wild ass by Leaf and Jatubex. Really, really awesome to see these guys here. I think we'll have a look at the male. Let's have a look at you. Really, really beautiful. Anyway, the African wild ass or the African wild donkey. These guys are a wild horse in the family Equidae, and they're also thought to be the ancestor of the domestic donkey, and they're sometimes placed within the same species, as we'll get into. And they live in the deserts of arid areas of like Horn Africa and Ethiopia and Somalia. These guys are the Somali wild ass, so they live around kind of Somalia, things like that. And they used to have a wider range into like Libya and Sudan and Egypt, but due to the hunting and a lot of other things, they're basically considered critically endangered now. So these guys are actually quite a decent size. They get about 1.2 meters tall, or about 4 foot tall, weigh about 250 kilograms or 600 pounds, and they have that short coat with that fawn color, and they are a slender dorsal stripe going down the back here, as you can see here, in all subspecies. While the Nubian wild ass, as well as the domestic donkey, has a stripe around the shoulder. The Somali wild ass is a little bit different in that regard. They don't have that stripe on the shoulder. These guys have almost like a horizontal banding, like a zebra on their legs. So that's kind of the main way you can tell the Somali and the Nubian wild ass apart. And you can see on the nape of the neck, they also have this stiff mane. They also have a tail with this black brush here, and they have slender and hooves and things like that. And it's approximately kind of the diameter of their legs, so kind of slim hooves, things like that. So in terms of taxonomy, sometimes the domestic donkey is kind of considered a different species, or sometimes considered the same species, but mainly there's two subspecies recognized: the Nubian wild ass, which is almost considered to be extinct, and the Somali wild ass, which is almost considered to be extinct as well. But we're talking about the Somali, of course. But in terms of their habitat, these guys typically live in desert or semi-desert environments where they're able to digest all sorts of different kinds of vegetation. And they also have, like other horses, they have large ears to detect predation and things like that. And because of the sparse vegetation, these guys actually live somewhat separate from each other, except for mothers and young. And unlike other types of wild horse, they don't live in really tight family groups. But they have very loud voices and can be heard over 3 kilometers or so, or 1.9 miles, so they can keep in contact with other horses in the area or other wild asses. In terms of behavior, they're typically active during the cooler hours before like late afternoon to early morning, where they seek shade and shelter along the rocky hills. They're also quite nimble and can be quite fast. They've been recorded reaching speeds of 70 kilometers an hour or 43 miles. And they have particularly hard soles to help protect their feet and fast-growing hooves as they move over terrain. They also maintain and defend quite large territories. They make up to about 23 kilometers in size, where they use dung heaps to basically maintain them. And due to the size of these ranges, the dominant male cannot really exclude other males, since they're obviously really, really hard to maintain an area of that size and keep it protected. Rather, the intruders are typically just tolerated, treated as subordinates, and they're kept as far as possible from the females. And in the presence of an estrang female, the male will bray loudly, and these animals will live in loose herds of up to 50 or so individuals. And in terms of their breeding, these guys breeding occurs in the wet season, and they have a gestation period of about 11 to 12 months, where one foal, like this little guy here, will be born in October to February. The foal will be weaned 6 to 8 months after birth, and they reach sexual maturity at about 2 years of age, and the lifespan in captivity is estimated to be up to 40 years. And wild asses, as I mentioned, can run quite fast, almost as fast as any other horse, normal horse, but unlike most hoofed animals, they do not really flee in a dangerous situation, but they tend to actually investigate first and decide what they need to do. And when they can obviously kick and defend themselves quite well because they're large and dangerous animals. And they actually were used to pull wagons in ancient Sumer and like 2000 BC, which is pretty interesting. And it's suggested that these may actually be ognars, as we'll get into, but now they're considered domestic asses. In terms of African wild asses' diets, these guys will feed on grasses, barks, and leaves. Due to them living in an arid climate, they are quite dependent on water, so they need to. They don't really get all the moisture they need from the vegetation like other species, but they must drink at least once every 3 days. However, they can survive on a small amount of liquid and have actually been reported drinking salty or brackish waters, so they must be able to filter that with their larger kidneys. In terms of conservation status, um, because there's the domestic breed and they're quite common, um, while the species itself is often considered not threatened with extinction because of that, the two extant subspecies that are in the wild are often considered critically endangered. With African wild asses being caught and domesticated, they kind of distinct decline in their population. So there's not only about a few hundred left in the wild. I believe the estimation's like less than 1,000. Competition with domestic livestock as well, and reducing like water sources and development like that is often really hurting their populations, though they are legally protected in the countries they've found. And there's a protected population in Israel of the Somali wild ass. And this was established to help bolster endangered species in the area. And populations of asses are fairly resilient, though, and they are protected. So they may well recover. They just need areas to live out their lives, and they're really, really cool. Somali wild asses, I think, are quite cool. I believe the population is about 570 in the wild and about 150 in captivity. So, yeah, not doing the best, as I mentioned, critically endangered, but they are protected. They just need more area to roam and some time to recover, and I think they'll be fine. Really, really awesome species. Now we're moving on to the Persian ognar. So another really cool animal here. The Persian ognar. So this is kind of a subspecies, as I mentioned, of the ognar. It's more specifically a subspecies. They're also called the Persian wild ass or the Persian zebra. These guys are a subspecies of the ognar, and they're quite rare. There's only about 600 individuals in the wild, which sucks, but at least there's some population captivity. Let me just go back to where I was. Oh, I need to go back. I was kind of mixing up my reference. But yeah, really, really awesome. These guys inhabit kind of mountainous areas, semi-deserts or desert plains. Their largest population lives in the Khatun National Park. And these guys used to live across from the Middle East to China until the 19th century. And their population had been reduced to several thousand to a few thousand at the time, and currently there's more than 600 or so in the wild. And they basically are a different subspecies because the ognar is reserved for this subspecies, and the whole like Asiatic wild ass is simply known as the ognar, but they do not serve that purpose because these guys are technically the true ognar. In terms of their habitat and distribution, as I mentioned, they live in semi-deserts, things like that. They're also listed as endangered by the IUCN, and currently they're closer to extinction because of competition with livestock, droughts, and poaching for their meat and hides. That's their biggest danger to the species. But luckily, they are protected in most of their range, which is obviously really cool. And all that. In terms of their size, these guys are kind of the most horse-like of the wild asses. And they are short-legged compared to horses, and their color actually varies a lot during the breeding season. They have these black stripes down their back as well. And they have their belly, rump, and muzzle is white in most of the ognars. And the exception is the Mongolian wild ass, which has a broad dorsal stripe that is white, but this is obviously not that one. They're quite a bit larger than donkeys as well. They get about 200 to 290 kilograms, or 440 to 640 pounds. And about 2.1 to 2.5 or 6 to 8 feet in head to body length, with males typically being a little bit larger than the females. So the species itself kind of lives all over from pretty much Mongolia down into India, and the Persian ognar is only found at the moment in two subpopulations in southern and northern Iran, which have also been extirpated from Afghanistan. In terms of social structure, they're more similar to most equids. These guys are quite social, and stallions either are solitary or live in groups of 2 to 3, and have been observed in harems of females, but other studies show that the dominant stallion defends territories that attracts females, and actually varies a lot, their social behavior. Sometimes in different habitats, they can take different kind of harems and groups. It just really depends on the population. And in terms of reproduction, so you can find these cute little guys here. In terms of reproduction, they reach sexual maturity at about 2 years old, and they start mating about 3 to 4 years old. The breeding is seasonal, and similar to the wild ass, the African wild ass, their Gestation period is about 11 months, and they usually give birth rather quick, and these births typically take place to April to September, with accumulation from June to July. And the mating season in India is the raining season. And typically the foal can stand up like 15 to 20 minutes after birth, and they tend to form groups of up to 5 females and their young. And during rearing, these will remain close, and occasionally these stallions are territorial and expel the young male when he's grown up a bit and kind of kick them out. But yeah, really, really cute little guys here, and they reach an age about 14 years in the wild, but in captivity they can live up to 26 years. Very similar to other equids, they're also quite herbivorous. Let's see if we can find one standing over here. They feed on herbs and grasses, things like that, and they browse on shrubs and trees and dry habitats. And during the winter as well, these guys will often eat snow as a substitute for water, and when natural water sources are unavailable, they'll often dig into dry riverbeds and often get to that subsurface water. And these water holes are often sometimes visited by domestic livestock and other animals, so they're quite important in that regard, which is pretty cool. In terms of predators, in the wild, they were preyed upon by Persian and striped hyenas. In a few cases, they've been killed in Iran by leopards, but in the Middle East, they're also killed by Asiatic lions and tigers, and also preyed upon formerly by dholes, cheetahs, potentially bears, and mugger crocodiles may actually be a threat to these guys as well. But the main predator to these guys is grey wolves. And however, like most equids, they're known to have anti-predator behaviors. They'll often cooperate and try and chase off predators, or sometimes even kick and defend themselves, which is really, really cool. And the biggest threats, as I mentioned, is like hides and habitat degradation, competition of livestock as well. Overgrazing is another big issue for these guys. Also, diseases that can be spread from livestock is a big issue for these guys. But they're doing okay. The species as a whole, I believe, is considered near threatened, but the particular subspecies of the agnar is considered endangered. But they are legally protected where they are, and they live in safe areas, so they're doing okay in that regard. Yeah, really, really cool. So, second to last animal, we're moving on to some pretty cool animals here. This is what the Persian agnar was done by Leaf, J2Bex, and Trumped. We're moving on to the Asiatic lion. So this was done by Havoc1199, Gaboy, and Genora Pizza, and it looks wonderful. I love this remaster it got. So we've got here the Asiatic lion. So these guys are a population of Panthera leo that only survive today in India. And basically they're only restricted to the Gir National Park in the Indian state of Gujarat. But historically they inhabited much of Middle East and Northern India. So in terms of their taxonomy, they were often considered sometimes a different subspecies, but most recent genetics basically considers them two subspecies. There's Panthera leo and Panthera leo melicata, I believe you say that. So basically the sub-Saharan and the basically North African / Asian population, which includes the Barbary lion, all that same subspecies. And the difference between the Barbary and the Asiatic lions is really just like a difference in population and climate, because obviously the mountains of North Africa are a bit cooler than India, which is pretty interesting. In terms of how they're related, though, these two groups of the Asiatic and the North and West African lions potentially split about 186,000 years ago, but there was obviously still gene flow going on there. And the main characteristics of the Asiatic lion, as you can kind of see here, they've got that tawny color to them with the speckled as well. And males actually do not have quite as large manes as like other populations of lions, especially like the Barbary lion or the African lions that you typically see. And about half of the skulls have actually have divided interorbital foramina, while the African lions typically only have one foramen on either side, which is very interesting. And they have a shoulder height of about 107 to 120 centimeters tall, and females get about 80 to 107 centimeters tall. So between 42 and 47 inches for the males, and 31 to 42 for the females. And two lions in the Gir forest were actually measured about 1.98 meters, or 6'6", from head to tail, with a 7.9, 8.9 meter, or 31 to 35 inch tail. And they're not really much bigger. They are typically smaller than large African lions, but they reach similar sizes to the Central African lions, mainly just due to population, things like that. The typical weight for an adult African, Asian or Asiatic lion, a typical adult male weighs about 160 kilograms, or 353 pounds, with the limit being about 190 kilograms, while female will weigh about 100 to 130 kilograms, or about 220 to 285 pounds. And as I mentioned, you can see here, there's lots of variation within lion manes as well. But the main difference between the Asiatic and the African lions is these guys typically have much more less developed manes. And the manes of most lions are actually less developed and do not actually extend as much as kind of the African lions. And also lions with much smaller manes were also known from Egypt, Syria, and Arabia. So it's very possible this could be just to the conditions of the area where they're much warmer. They don't need that quite so large mane, which is pretty interesting. Now, there are some pretty epically sized lions, or some exceptionally big lions. There was a lion that was a male found in 1620 that was about 10 feet long and weighed about 306 kilograms. So obviously people can say different things like that. They said to be large lions, things like that. But because hunters and, people want to exaggerate, they're not really taken too lightly. Taken very seriously, I mean. So in terms of their distribution, as I mentioned, they tend to live all across the Middle East and into India. But due to obviously hunting and things like that, they really only now live in the Gir forest. And there's a dedicated sanctuary for these guys that was founded in 1965, and is the only habitat really in India now supporting these lions. And they typically inhabit these forest habitats and the subtropical dry forest, savanna, and places of these areas as well, with some other sanctuaries being set up to help the expanding population. They kind of reached their lowest point at about 2010. They were on the brink of extinction. There were 411 individuals by 2010, and approximately 105 lions lived outside this forest, which was actually a quarter of the whole population. Dispersing subadults actually established new territories and things like that, and the satellite lion population has actually been increasing a lot, so that's quite good. By 2015, the population had grown to 523, with inhabiting an area of about 7,000 kilometers squared, or 2,700 miles. And the most recent estimate, about 2020, I believe there's about 600, 700 lions now living in the park and living around the Gir forest and things like that. But as I mentioned, they had such a large range. They lived across the Middle East and into Caucasia, potentially in the Holocene, so within the last few hundred years. Even the last sightings of these guys in like Syria was like the 1870s. But sadly, they kind of went extinct because of people hunting them. In terms of their ecology and behavior, these guys are not too different from other lions, of course. Let's have a look at these guys here. Not too different from other lions. They use that kind of marking behavior. The pairs of lion will rest together. They're typically solitary, and they usually associate with up to 3 males. These males are, but the females will live in loose pride as well. And research actually shows that these guys vary a lot in their home ranges, between 144 to 230 square kilometers, or 38 to 89 square miles, during the dry and wet season. And the coalitions of males will actually defend home ranges that have more than one or more prides, and they will hold this territory longer than a single lion. And males with coalitions of up to 3 to 4 individuals have like a hierarchy, with one male being the boss. In terms of feeding ecology, they generally eat prey about 190 to 550 kilograms, or 420 to 1,200 pounds. Often they'll kill domestic livestock as well, but they'll often, in the national park now, they feed on things such as chital, sambar deer, Nigal cattle, water buffalo, wild boar. A lot of those animals they'll eat as well. But during the hot months, they'll also prey upon animals such as dromedaries, and mugger crocodiles as well. And obviously, as their range was bigger historically, they would have eaten a lot of other things. They would eat like wild boar. Pretty much anything large enough for them to kill, they'll generally eat it. In terms of breeding, though, the Asiatic lion typically breeds around, they mate around October, November, with mating lasting about 3 to 6 days. Typically, gestation lasts about 110 days, with litters having between 1 to 4 cubs. And due to the average interval, is the births is about 24 months, unless the cubs are killed due to infanticide by males or because of disease or injuries. These cubs will then grow up and become independent at about the age of 2 years old, with subadult males leaving the adult pride at about 3 years of age and going to find their own and becoming nomads, which is really, really interesting as well. And in terms of threats, they only live as a single population today, which obviously is a big threat to them. That makes them like a large forest fire or a epidemic of a disease could wipe them out. So that's why people are really, really interested in trying to get them out of the Jurac forest and starting another population. There's also poaching incidents and that have really affected these guys as well. Poaching, habitat loss, and there's even been lions found with canine distemper, which has killed several lions in both the Serengeti and the Gure forest, which is not good. Also livestock, which has reduced the population of the native ungulates they prey upon, which obviously causes them to go out and hunt livestock, which is not good. And this has obviously caused conflicts with humans. But in terms of conservation, there's been effort to try and reintroduce them to a lot of areas. By the 1950s, they were basically advised to set up another population to try and protect them in case if something happens at the Gure forest. But there's been a lot of political red tape in that regard. Djurgården kind of wants to be the only place with lions. They often resist this relocation, but they want to stay, basically, they don't want to lose their status as the only home of Asian lions. But obviously, for the health of the lions, they do probably need to be moved, some of them at least. And obviously that's kind of because of people being people, a little bit of ego in there. But there have been efforts to try and reintroduce them. But there's also populations in captivity as well, especially in Europe and stuff. They have been interbred with African lions, which is not good for that. But other than that, they're pretty cool. Being important in culture as well and all that, especially around like Indian and Chinese culture. They're like in the zodiac, the Burmese zodiac as well. Often were used in like Babylon, and also I believe they were hunted in the Caucasus as well, and like the myths of the lion, the Nemean lion is a myth of Greek, and things like that. But yeah, really, really cool animal. Have had a great impact on history, and hopefully the politics of trying to keep them inside the Gure forest doesn't really affect them too much, and people want to try and get them out of there. So really, really awesome species to talk about. And last but most certainly not least, we've got the giant deer, or Megaloceros, by Narwhalo, which I'm very, very excited to talk about. See this wonderful big male here. So the other people call them the Irish elk. That's not the best name for them because they're not actually closely related to the either European elk or the North American elk or the moose. They're not really related to them. So usually they just call them the Irish elk because there's been lots of fossils found of them in Ireland. But the often are more called giant deer, or just by their scientific name, the Megaloceros. Pretty interesting. They're first described at about 1695, where they were in the genus Alce giganteus. They were basically considered a species of moose. But until George Cuvier in 1812 kind of considered them the Megaloceros, or the Irish elk. And they basically evolved from other species around kind of the middle Pleistocene, about 500,000 years ago. That's when the species here, Megaloceros giganteus, kind of evolved, and then it spread out from basically Europe into like Siberia. The furthest part of their range is kind of Lake Baikal in Siberia, so they typically lived all across that area and into Europe, and really, really interesting guys here. And in terms of how they're related to, they were thought to be related to, as I mentioned, the deer, elk, but not really. Most recent evidence suggests that they're now actually closely related to things like fallow deer, so related to Dharma, and this is supported by genetic evidence and obviously morphological evidence as well, which is really, really cool. In terms of their description here, they're very, very large. They're basically the third largest known deer. They're basically tied with the Alaskan moose, and second only to Cervus latifrons and Scotty, which were both really large deer, like the Scotty or the stag moose. They both got pretty much a ton, almost. But these guys were still quite large. They're credited as having the largest antlers out of any known deer, with a maximum of about 3.65 or 12 feet long from tip to tip, and up to about 40 kilograms in weight of the antlers. But the deer itself stood about 2.1 meters or 6 foot 11 foot tall at the shoulder, and for body weight they generally got about 450 to 600 kilograms, or 990 to 1300 pounds, and up to about 700 kilograms, about 1500 pounds or more, which makes them kind of the third heaviest. And like other species of deer, they have this extreme sexual dimorphism. The females are typically much smaller, The Irish elk bulks, bulls probably got about 450 to 700 kilograms, as I mentioned, but the females got a little bit smaller, about 460 kilograms, or about 1,000 pounds on average. As you can see, a little bit smaller there. But yeah, really, really interesting. And based on a lot of Paleolithic paintings, these guys may have actually had a lot of this really interesting color to them. They had this like dark stripe running down their back or the haunches, things like that. And even suggested they're almost like a bison. They may have had a hump. And that may have been because of the large antlers, and they needed large muscles and ligaments to kind of support the large antlers that they have here, which is really interesting. And while they're called the Irish elk sometimes, they were not exclusively found in Ireland. They were found pretty much across the Mammoth Steppe as well. They did not really appear to get that far south though, or north or east. But they typically lived around like the western of Lake Baikal to the east. Those are found around the Atlantic Ocean, kind of in Europe and Britain and the UK, and Ireland is kind of the western part of their range as well. In terms of their biology as well, these guys were seen to be quite cursorial and were a mixed browser. So these guys would eat both browse and grass. And really, really interesting. And it actually suggests a lot from how they were found in like bogs and things. These guys would have very much lived like other types of deer. They would have been polygamous. So the biggest males would have fought for the females. And most Irish elk seem to have died from like winter kill and things like that. Very similar to a lot of modern species of deer. And these large antlers are actually typically been explained by male-to-male battles, but sometimes used as displays, things like that. But they suggest that they were really used during fighting and push against each other, things like that. And from what we know by estimates of the baby size compared to modern deer, a 460 kilogram doe may have had a gestation period of about 274 days. And based on this pattern, the last year's antlers of the Irish elk would shed around early March, and peak antler growth would be in early June, and then by mid-July they'd shed that velvet and kind of have that main kind of big antlers that you typically see. So they would have a gestation of like almost a year, so really interesting. And they also believed to be cursorial, and concluded that they would have produced a nutrient-rich milk, which would allow the calf to stay up with the herd and things like that. And as I mentioned, these guys would have been quite cursorial, and they have mesodont teeth or high teeth, which means they were a mixed feeder. And pollen shows that they typically fed on a lot of different plants and forbs. But dental also shows that they, between the middle and late Pleistocene in Britain, they were a mixed feeding, and they'll feed on leaves and graze. So typically just depends on what they were eating. And based on their dietary requirements, they actually estimated that an Irish elk that was about 675 kilograms or 1,400 pounds would need to consume of about 39.7 kilograms or 88 pounds of fresh forage daily. And they would have needed about 1,372 grams of protein or 3 pounds of protein over 120 days to grow out their antlers, which is really, really interesting to think about how much they would need to grow that all out. And in terms of their predators, these guys would have been preyed upon by a lot of the large animals at the time, the large predators such as, of course, cave lions and cave hyenas. So in terms of their extinction, these guys, outside of the late Pleistocene, these guys were pretty much uncommon, and they were usually rare where they did occur. And there's been a hypothesis that these guys were kind of maladapted, but often they kind of were not very common in their ecosystems, and they decreased actually in antler size from the late Pleistocene into the Holocene. And the range of this taxon apparently collapsed around the last glacial maximum, about 227,500 or about 14,600 years ago. And the last kind of evidence showed that these guys may have lived into the Holocene in places such as Ireland up until about 7,000 years ago. So they are quite a recent extinction compared to a lot of the other Ice Age megafauna. And we can obviously get into the big discussions about what killed off the megafauna, things like that. But very likely a lot of those similar factors would have affected these guys. But yeah, we also have a lot of cave paintings of these guys done by ancient Paleolithic hunters and potentially Neanderthals, things like that. And they've really made a lasting impact on like the culture because of the paintings that we see of them. And they actually tell us a lot about potentially how they were looked at in life. So that makes them really, really interesting. And plus, they're just such big and huge animals, and those antlers are just so impressive. I think Narwhal really did a wonderful job representing this guy. So, yeah, I think this would be a great place to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified about anything. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.